Please join me in prayer. Holy Spirit, may we bear witness to your work in the world, the glimpses of purpose and of hope we can still see despite all the things going on around us. And may we in turn be part of that purpose and even part of that hope. Amen. Reading these two stories and preparing for this morning, I saw two stories of barriers and boundaries. And so what I'm going to do is offer three reflections on those topics. In our first story, our Old Testament story, this little glimpse of Jacob and his father-in-law Laban, it's pretty easy to see the boundary in this story because the story is about building a boundary. They get a stone and they set it between them and they build a heap of stones around it and they break bread at the stone, which is usually part of making a covenant. You would normally make an agreement and then you would make something permanent to mark the covenant and then you would eat together as a way to kind of finalize it. And so they've done all these things to build a boundary between the two of them. At this point, this had become necessary. You might remember that Jacob had worked 14 years to gain two of Laban's daughters for his wives. The first 7 years, he got the daughter that Laban wanted him to have. And then the second 7 years, he got the daughter that he wanted and was in love with all along. And then even after this, Jacob has been working for Laban for 14 years. And Jacob, he's a crafty guy. He's smart. And he's good at making money. He's good at turning a little flock into a big flock. And Laban loves this. And so Laban doesn't want to lose his goose that lays the golden eggs. And so Laban and Jacob kind of wheedle each other in a situation where each of them thinks that they're kind of scamming the other one and getting the upper hand. And this story comes to a point here where they need to set a boundary because they've had enough of each other and they need to move on. And they're not going to fight, although it got close more than once. But they also can't really be together. And so we're going to build this heap of witness, and I love that the translation insists on calling it a heap instead of any more poetic or dramatic term. It's just a heap of stones. A heap of witness between the two of them. I've seen what happens when money, when resources becomes a source of conflict for a family. This can get ugly fast. Some of the ugliest situations I've ever seen in families. In particular, some memories come up where there's been a church member who has been fighting with their family, and this has happened more than once over my career, over an inheritance. And a group of siblings don't agree on the inheritance, or different family factions don't agree on an inheritance, and maybe the will isn't clear, or someone lost it, or they're arguing over, that's not the real one, this is the real one. And it can go very quickly from, we all need to talk about this, to, I will burn your life down before I give you grandma's ring. And I've seen that slide. I've seen 6 figures of wealth burnt away in litigation over 6 figures of wealth. So that by the time someone wins, it's gone. Congratulations, you won. You won nothing. And consistently, my advice tends to end up being, stop. You need to stop. Stop fighting. You're not going to win. Play stupid games. Win stupid prizes. This isn't going to work out. And in some cases, people are able to, and in some cases, they're not. So I've seen situations where the best case scenario would be the fighting members of this family build a heap of witness between them and go their separate ways. A situation where that is fantastic. That's the best case. Jacob had a lot of trouble with his father-in-law. The two of them were both kind of scammers. They were trying to work an angle on each other consistently. I've been fortunate with in-laws. I think Pam's not here, but she'd probably agree. There's a thing that I don't remember where I heard this or where I read it, but it's rung true that your family is able to push your buttons because they're the ones who installed them. And you might have this experience, right? Like someone else's family is lovely, and if they're frustrating, they're quirky, and your family is infuriating. Why are you like this? It's because your buttons came in part because of your family. They put them there, and they know right where to push them. So Pam's family doesn't push my buttons. I think they're fine. She can get angry with them periodically, but I'm fine with that. I'm fine with them. And vice versa, sometimes Pam gets pretty tired of my family, whereas I kind of think like, what's going on? But I've been fortunate with in-laws, but that doesn't mean there isn't a value to setting a clear boundary sometimes. It doesn't have to be as dramatic as let God be a witness between us, I don't want to see you again. Maybe it gets to that point. But periodically, there's a good reason to sit down and set a clear boundary about something and then walk away. You've settled it, no more fighting. I've said more about boundaries in the past. I will in the future. Just a note in the first reflection that here they're setting a boundary, and in their relationship with each other, this heap of stones and walking opposite directions might be the best thing they ever did for each other in their stories. For the second reflection, I want to start by taking a moment to think back to early COVID. Think back to like March, April, May 2020. Some of us sprayed Lysol on our mail. Some of us wiped down our groceries. We did not know what was going on, and it was very frightening. We didn't know the limits of COVID. We didn't know what all the short-term symptoms would be. We didn't know any of the long-term symptoms of long COVID that would be revealed. We didn't know when or if there would be a vaccine. It was terrifying. Some of us had to keep going to work. Some of us were able to not go to work. Some of us lost our job and had to figure out something else. And we learned about things like social distancing and masking, and we got retrained in how to wash our hands. Some of us had forgotten, so we got a chance to relearn how to wash our hands. Sing happy birthday while you're scrubbing or whatever it is to get enough time. So that was our situation, and it was very frightening, and honestly, I think our society is still traumatized by it, and we're just not talking about it anymore, not addressing it. But imagine if it was that way for every disease. Imagine if it was that way for every symptom. You didn't know why you were sick. You didn't know how it would spread or not spread. You didn't know how long it would last, and there would never be a vaccine. That's the situation in the ancient world with disease. That's the situation in the biblical world. You would see symptoms and not know why they're happening, or when they'll stop, or what caused them. And in a lot of cases, there was treatment for some of the symptoms, but not for the underlying disease. And so this situation gives rise to some strange rules about contact, about cleanliness and uncleanliness, about how you treat people who have different visible illnesses. And these are strange rules, but from this point of view, I don't think they're irrational rules. It's like us in early COVID. We're trying to figure out how to stay alive, how to stay healthy, and we don't know. So we try the best we can and wait to learn more. But in like the Iron Age, you're not going to learn more. There's no CDC. There's no vaccines. And so this woman in our second story who had this ongoing hemorrhage for 12 years, the diagnosis that she would receive, because she had gone to doctors, she'd spent all of her money, they weren't able to cure her. In our minds, we think, that's unsurprising. There wasn't a lot of knowledge of internal medicine at this point. I don't even know what they were trying, but I assume it wouldn't work very well. So she spent all her money on doctors trying to be cured, and they can't cure her. And so her diagnosis would be, you've sinned. You're unworthy, and God has cursed you with this disease. And so as a result, you basically cannot have contact with anyone anymore. Because for symptoms like this, the prescription was, you can never touch anyone again. Because anyone you touch becomes unclean and has to be separated from society for 7 days. And then there's a cost. They have to go to the temple. They have to make a sacrifice of restitution to become clean again with God. That's her diagnosis, and that's the prescription. You've sinned, you're unworthy, and you just don't get human contact. It's early COVID forever. And you don't have a bubble, and you don't have a household, you're just cut off. When I thought about it this way, I had a lot more sympathy for the woman in this story. Not that I lacked sympathy before, but there's something about having gone through a lesser version of what she went through, and knowing that it's a shared experience that other people have now had to some degree or another. It kind of changed the way I thought about it. Remember how awkward it was during the early sort of incremental return from social distancing and lockdowns and so on? Like, we have a story, right before COVID hit, we got our dog named Patches. He was a rescue, and then we kind of rescued him from the rescue. So he's a double rescue. And so he wasn't sure about us at all. And in retrospect, I can't blame him. He was handed off from his original family to us. He didn't know why. Nobody explained it to him. And so we were walking in the park one day, trying to get some exercise, get out in nature. This is in 2020. And Pam and I are talking, and I realized that there's no longer any pull at the end of the leash, because he had just looked over his shoulder, bitten through the leash, and ran off. So now we're just chasing a dog through a park. And, I'm not built for speed. Neither is Patches, but he has 4 legs and I have 2. So I'm just, I'm like, okay, my ancestors were pursuit predators. I'm just gonna jog along until I catch him. And Patches was like, my ancestors were also pursuit predators, and you're never gonna catch me, man. And we'd run past other people who were in the park trying to get some exercise, trying to be out in nature. And we were like, could you help us with our dog? And they're like, no. Don't you know there's a pandemic on? I'm not going to catch your dog and hand him to you and get close to you and risk contact. So finally we had someone who was like, oh, because he ran up to sniff this other person and kind of wagged his tail like he wanted a third family now. And so I was like, please, could you just grab our dog? So she grabs the dog, and then we're like, okay, how are we going to do this handoff? We're both afraid. We're strangers. So we end up turning around and backing toward each other so that she can then hand me the dog without facing or breathing on each other. This is early COVID. And maybe you have stories like this of just the weirdness. But imagine if you had that kind of limitation around your contact with people, but it was just you. You're singled out. Everyone else comes back. Everyone else can have contact and relationships and hugs and kisses and whatever, but not you. It's going to be like that, backwards handing patches to get through life forever. And I thought about how COVID was easier because it was shared. Because we can all chuckle and think of our own weird early COVID stories. We all have some version of awkwardness, of separation. But imagine if it was just you. Everybody else continues as normal. Imagine that loneliness. So there are a couple different kinds of boundaries and barriers that we're talking about. There are the boundaries that we set that are ideally clear and shared. This is the line. We agree to the line. Go our separate ways. No ghosting, no passive aggression, just clarity. We're walking away. Build a heap of stones if it helps. And then there's the barriers that exist between us, reasonable or otherwise. The barriers that existed between us during COVID, the barriers that existed between this woman and everyone in that crowd, including Jesus. Everyone in her family, everyone in her life, separated from her by a barrier. And as we experienced during COVID, when those barriers eventually come down, because here we are, when those barriers eventually come down, it's this huge relief. But it's important to think about and remember who's left out when those barriers come down. There are still people who can't come back. There are still people who never came back to normal because they're immune compromised. They have health issues that we don't know about. They were masking before it was cool. They're social distanced because otherwise they're dead. And imagine watching everyone else rush back over the barriers, hug and handshake, and you're left out again. Often when there are barriers between us, always when there are barriers between people and God, those barriers are ones that we create. Because think about it, this woman was separated from every person in her life, but she walked right up to Jesus and touched him. There was no barrier there. She just went up, boom, that's God right there. Nothing separating her from him. Think of all the barriers she had to go through to get there. It's hard to ask, it's hard to think about, but as a church, it's important and worthwhile to think about who isn't here. What people, what categories of people isn't here? And are they not here because there's a barrier that we've set up, maybe intentionally, that we should think about, maybe unintentionally? We just don't know why someone isn't here. We don't think about it. In the same way, before COVID, we didn't think about people as much who were immune compromised unless they're in our life. We didn't think about masking. We didn't think about social distancing. None of that. What other barriers are there that we're unaware of? Barriers that we've put in place or that we've inherited and haven't considered. And when thinking about who isn't here, I want to make the important note that it isn't about tokenism, right? It isn't about collecting diverse kinds of people like we're collecting Pokemon, right? We don't have like a checklist of like, okay, do we have this kind of person and this kind of person and this kind of person? Because we're not a big church. And so we're going to be a good place for some people to come and be welcomed. And for others, it'll be awkward. There might be a better church for them. We need to be discerning. But the thing we need to be discerning is, what are the barriers that keep people out? What are the barriers that we might even have put up between people and God? Ones that don't affect us so we don't notice, but someone else is kept out. I thought about this as I imagined how this woman got to Jesus. So this woman's been living for 12 years, unable to touch anyone. If you brush against her in a crowd, you are unclean. You're separated from the community for 7 days. You have to make restitution at a temple. There's a cost. So how did she just slip through and get to Jesus through a press of a crowd? Probably because they weren't looking for her. Probably because she had become invisible over time. There's always that barrier, so we just step around her, and then we don't talk to her, and then we don't see her. And so she's able to walk right up and touch Jesus, brush past, 10, 20, 50 people that she made unclean to get there, and none of them notice. When Jesus turns around and says, "Who touched my cloak?" no one says anything. They're like, "I don't know. Did you? What happened?" They still don't even see that she's there. But Jesus noticed. He noticed immediately, just a slight touch. But Jesus noticed this person who had walked invisible through a crowd. Noticing people is one of the things that Jesus did really well. He noticed Zacchaeus up in the tree. He noticed the woman at the well. He noticed the guy chained up in the graveyard. He noticed this woman who came to him for healing. It's worth thinking about how good Jesus was at noticing people no one else noticed. And as we look for who's missing, I hope that we continually do. I think it's important to remember that if there is a barrier between someone and God, it wasn't put there by God. It was put there by us. Amen.